All right, looks like we're rolling. Welcome everybody. Today is February, is that 14 today? Yes,
Yeah.
it is.
Yeah.
Valentine's Day. And this is the bi-weekly SIG VMware meeting. We're gonna start off with the usual community updates. So Steve, you can take it off.
Okay. I'm going to start with a wrap up of things I noticed while looking at the community activity in Slack and the mailing list. One is that there seems to be recurring interest in resizing of persistent volumes. The use case for this is that you might deploy a stateful app like a database, have it proceed to go fill the persistent volume it uses over time, but you want to provide for late arriving growth and capacity. Just for those who aren't aware, I know people can't go to every SIG, but this is under active discussion now over in the Kubernetes storage SIG. And in the notes, I posted a link to this running planning document. There are actually meetings, I've been to a few of them. I don't honestly recollect what the schedule for that meeting is, whether it's every 2 weeks, every 4, but go to the doc for a start and you can see what's going on there. Just be advised if you're a user that it's almost a certainty that this resizing support is not going to be backfilled into the existing legacy entry storage driver. We've entered into a phase where the rules are that new features go into CSI only. So if you're interested in this, it probably isn't going to happen soon as in the next few weeks or months, but because it's still in the planning stages, but it is going to happen. Now's the time when you can get involved in influence the outcome. If you're out there in the dev, and I hope we've got some of the devs out of the storage business unit and others working on storage on this call. If you weren't aware that this is going on, I think this is clearly a feature that users are interested in. So and it's important that we get support for this feature into the CSI driver for vSphere. Moving on, there have also been recurring calls for help that ultimately, once people resolve this issue, turn out to be a missing set enable UUID parameter. And it's pretty clear to me that the error messages you get, the symptoms, they're not leading users back to the actual root cause of this being missing. Now, I haven't worked on the code, but I'm wondering if maybe some developers can offer an opinion here as to whether it's worth raising an issue to get more meaningful messages to come out in logs so that users don't end up having to go in Slack or the mailing list to figure out what's going on here. Anybody got any thoughts on this?
Hey, Steve, can you repeat that again? The missing UUID of what?
Yeah, so I think the last one that happened was in Slack, and somebody was complaining that they were having, I think, issues with persistent volume mounts, but I think potentially this missing UUID, enable UUID, materializes itself in other forms as well. And this isn't the first time somebody had an issue with this. It is documented, but it's obvious that people don't see this in the docs, or they might set this on some of their VMs and miss one. So it has been a recurring support request. So I'm wondering if there's an opportunity here to improve handling of a condition like this. Did that answer your question, Luke? Or
yeah.
So I think some of the people on the call have actually been drawn into some of these support requests too, but I don't honestly know what that code looks like. I think potentially this impacts code both in the storage plugin as well as the cloud provider, maybe elsewhere as well. Anyway, if nobody's got any thoughts other than me, I'll move on.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Sorry. Okay, I had mic problems earlier. Yeah, we can definitely improve the error message in that case, and then we had also started on a tool called VCP. Well, it's called VCP Cuddle, but we were going to rename it to something better, VCP at ADM or something. But the idea was that this tool would kind of check all the prerequisites. So you mentioned that they're documented, but having a way to check that you have the right set of permissions, check that disk UUID is enabled, all those different parameters, and then also be able to automate, setting that stuff up. So it's not something that's been completed or released, but that was kind of the idea behind that.
Yeah, if somebody really had some time to put into this on a project, maybe we could even consider getting an intern to do this kind of thing. But a validation parser would be great. I'm even thinking, this could be open-ended, but you could even do things like check nodes for certificates or proper setting of parameters and compliance with best practices. But it seems like this might be a really useful tool for users.
Yep, and most of those things you can do already with GoVC, but there's just more assembly required. So the idea was that we'd have a tool that is just more specific to the needs around all the cloud providers for vSphere.
Yeah, it would be like a nice first line of defense for anybody using any form of Kubernetes on vSphere to make the user experience better. Okay, well, let's just throw that idea out there, and maybe some people will materialize who would like to work on that, or maybe we can find some resources. Like I think this is something that the easier parts of a tool like that could perhaps be done by somebody new or an intern if we can find the resource.
Yep, and we have some of the details on that capture in GitHub, but maybe I don't know if this sort of work is kept worthy, but we could try to capture it in that.
Yeah, I think we could start by logging an issue, and maybe even there's a procedure, there's specific tags like you're invited to use by the Kubernetes community to mark things as suitable for newcomers, as projects to get used to the community. So this might be appropriate for that. Okay, another thing I wanted to mention is that Miles Gray updated his blog on using kubeadm with the vSphere cloud provider. So I think he first published this a month ago, but he did an update in the past week. And the material in that blog is really good. And there's a link to it in the meeting notes. Finally, KubeCon China presentation proposals are due, I think, in less than 2 weeks. I don't know the exact date because they recently gave a slight extension. But as a SIG, we're invited to have SIG-sponsored introductory and deep dive sessions. And of course, anybody in the community can also submit non-SIG related presentations. If anybody on this call has got ideas for or suggestions for presentations of some subject they'd like to hear, Fabio and I are very interested because we want to get some presentations out there under the auspices of this SIG. They have recently imposed new guidelines that say that you can't repeat sessions even from one region to another. So KubeCon Europe will happen a month before the China event, and we already have submits in for that, but we can't repeat those subjects. So we've got to come up with other topics. So just throwing that out there, does anybody here have any ideas? And the kinds of things I'd be especially interested in if we've got any users on the call would be talks about user experience, good or bad. And if anybody is a newcomer here, we can find people who will help you all the way to helping you write the CFP and co-present with you if you're a little nervous about going out there as a first-time speaker. So throwing it out there. Anybody got any ideas?
I mean, one suggestion I have is maybe we haven't talked yet enough about, for example, say the zone support that was added, I think last year with the vSphere cloud provider. Maybe something we can, go to talk around that, like how that gives a much more, good quality experience to the vSphere users. Essentially, give them,
Yeah,
I'm not the subject matter expert for that, but I just thought this is something that has not been touched upon so far too much, and might be worthwhile.
We had a talk on zones in Shanghai in November, but that support is improving, so maybe we could go back and revisit it. I'm thinking maybe zones plus something else, just because the reviewers are likely to go do a compare between what the last one was in China, and they will find that, but we could perhaps combine zones with a broader, as part of a broader topic. By any chance, are you interested in being a speaker on that subject?
Well, I haven't really looked into zone support, but I'm actually interested in looking into that. And that actually was one of the other questions that I wanted to bring up in this meeting. I just wanted to know who will be the right set of people who I can talk to know a little bit more detail about the zones integration.
Yeah. So right now, some others on the call can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think zone support is primarily for scheduling at this point, and for some aspects of storage combined with zones. In other words, once you start to use persistent volumes, the underlying implementation of where those volumes are hosted from can impact where you'd like your workloads to be scheduled. And I'm not sure that the support for zones when running on vSphere covers 100% of the possible use cases. So is there anybody here on the call who can speak to that?
Well, I can speak for the internal one, and Fabio might speak for the external one, the external cloud provider. Whatever Siddharth prefers to know, because the internal one is kind of deprecated, so don't want to waste your time, but it's currently being the used one. So.
Yeah, I think in terms of a KubeCon China talk, especially given that that's going to be almost 6 months from now, already to some extent,
exactly.
The world's headed CSI, and 6 months from now, the discussion of the entry becomes even more relevant.
I would probably, so here's the background that I'm trying to kind of, just to give the context here. So today, the cluster API vSphere provider that I primarily contribute towards today, we set up the vSphere cloud provider, but we use the in-tree version of it. I would like us to move to the out-of-tree version as well, but I'm a little uncertain because I haven't read about it much, but I'm not sure what is the maturity state of the external cloud provider. Is that at par with the in-tree one at the moment today, that we can work towards starting to support that, for example, say in the cluster API itself, number one, and then definitely the zone support, which I'm kind of intrigued by some of the use cases. Considering we are using the in-tree one in the cluster API provider today, so maybe even knowing a little bit more about just that as well might not hurt.
Yeah, my opinion is that the out-of-tree now just got released in December, and what's technically out there is alpha, so I wouldn't put it in production myself. But if you were aggressive, you could. There is a PR that last I looked was awaiting merge that would take the out-of-tree beyond the in-tree and features. So it's just on the verge of reaching and surpassing the feature set in the in-tree. But literally today, it's not there yet. Fabio, do you have any more color you can add on that?
Now for zone support, we're basically right now the same level of support for both in-tree and out-of-tree. And I think actually out-of-tree is slightly advanced right now. It's slightly more advanced than the in-tree one because it actually supports already storage, while there's an outstanding patch for storage support with zones for in-tree that is still not merged. Has been through a couple of review cycles and hasn't made it to master yet, but it will probably be there by the time 114 ships. But yeah, feature-wise, they're both pretty much the same. Implementation details totally different though.
And maturity wise, I don't know, whether you would go put it in production, maybe you want to wait a quarter, maybe not, right?
Probably from maturity wise, I think for those specific features, we're at the same level, I guess, since they both came out about at the same time. So they have the same maturity level, I would say. But obviously the in-tree provider has been there for a long time, although the out-of-tree cloud provider is from scratch rewrite that is eliminating a lot of interesting code paths that are being used in tree.
Well, the reason I'm pointing this out maturity-wise is just in case it isn't clear to newcomers. Once you go to out of tree, you're simultaneously forced to go to CSI for storage. You can't mix and match. So CSI support in Kubernetes is new. The vSphere CSI storage plugin is new. So you're moving to 3 new things simultaneously. And I don't know, maybe I'm conservative, but if it were a bet my job production scenario myself, I'm not sure I would want to be the first one to go try that stuff out.
Yeah, and then a couple other things probably to add too is the out of tree, the external one it's only supports 6.5 and higher, and then there's also no upgrade path currently. So if you're an existing user and you need to migrate your stuff,
newbies.
Yeah, so I know there's efforts both in cloud provider and storage to have migration mechanisms. Both of those are being developed and it won't be alpha maybe until 14 or 115. But if anyone was considering it, that's probably the safest way to do it for production environments, at least.
I think there's definitely an interesting move to do right now because, well, first of all, let's just say that the current out of tree components are still considered alpha, so we haven't reached a beta stage. I think we're about to release a beta version, and I think given that this really creeps into the active process update, I think we'll just start talking about that and move on from the community. But cloud provider right now is still released as 0.10, which is I would say the alpha 1 v1 alpha 1, as other people refer to. We're planning to have a beta release probably by the time 114 ships. Hopefully, it's going to be released in concert with the CSI. So we're probably going to tag either Alpha 2 or Beta 1. That's still TBD. And because those new versions will bring the zone support and for both cloud provider and CSI. So that's gonna happen with this new version. Speaking of cloud provider, we have had a problem with the in-tree one, which I wanted to highlight because apparently it's been kind of an interesting thing to track down. I put the note to the PR in the notes, in the meeting notes. We had a problem where the in-tree cloud provider, it's still in 113, checks for, when it patches IP addresses in the node, it checks for a specific MAC address. Actually, for 2 specific MAC addresses prefix. And And those two were supposed to be the only one used in VMware platforms, and turns out it's not the case. And there's actually two other prefixes that are being used for MAC
So it
addresses.
only checks for the prefix, not the full MAC address, because I was thinking that didn't make sense too.
No, it's just a prefix.
Okay.
The prefix, because the MAC address is basically built upon, the first part of the MAC address is the vendor. And given that VMware exposes a virtual NIC, it is actually considered a vendor to the operating system. So the operating system is a NIC, which is virtual.
I think that actually there are as many as 4 blocks allocated, but some of them might be on such ancient releases of ESX that they're technically not supported by the cloud provider anyway. But
yeah, but turns out that, you know, out of 4 prefixes that are they call OUIs that are associated with VMware, 2 of them were being used in the cloud provider, and turns out an end user actually had a third one that was not listed there, and the nodes were not patched with the IP address. So we had to fix that. We sent on a PR. The PR is number 73721, if I'm reading that correctly.
This only affects nodes running as Kubernetes masters or workers, right?
I'm sorry, say again?
This is only in relation to nodes that are actually your Kubernetes masters and workers. So if you, because I know of another scenario where if you do a convert of a legacy physical machine, you can end up with really bizarre MAC addresses. So that if this involves parsing of every VM that it comes across in a vSphere installation, there might actually be more than just those 4.
Yeah, that's actually a use case that we thought about. We decided not to do anything about it in tree because AutoTree solves that problem already. Because AutoTree, as I was saying before, is a total rewrite. So there's no check like that. The way the code path is structured in tree is completely different from AutoTree. So there's no check for that. That said, creating that new check actually exposed to a different problem that was apparently was picked up by somebody that sent out a PR today, because there's a check for if the so before checking for MAC address, there's a check that looks for the interface and see if the interface is a loopback interface, and if it's a loopback interface, it just skips it as it should. Apparently, that check doesn't work for whatever reason, and the new MAC address check that was introduced with the PR that I just mentioned is basically returning an error where the MAC address is shorter than 17 characters, because that's how long the MAC address should be. And apparently, a loopback interface doesn't have a MAC address, so we end up hitting that specific code path, and there's an error. So in that specific use case, turns out that the patch doesn't work. So we have to, we're looking into this fix, and given that the previous patch, the one for the MAC addresses, was backported to 111, 112, and 113, we want to make sure that this new patch, once it's merged, ends into those other all versions of Kubernetes. So whenever there's a new patch coming out for those releases, we have both fixes in place. So that is, if you have any experience, if you're running a Kubernetes cluster on vSphere, and if you want to check out that patch, please do, because it's actually very important. I want to see if we're hitting other bugs in that, because as I was saying, the code paths and the in-tree provider are sometimes very complicated to follow through, and they may lead to unexpected outcomes that we're not anticipating. So please do test them if you are able to. So that is pretty much it for cloud provider. There's been some movement on cluster API. Look, if you want to give an update, I can switch to note taker.
Sure. There's only for the vSphere cloud provider. It's really mostly quiet. Because we're focused on trying to get the main repo, cluster API repo, to V1 Alpha 1. However, there has been a couple of issues that have been merged recently. We now have, so there was a bug that was found thanks to NetApps, where kubeadm, our templates for bringing up, I think Kubernetes 1.13 and up. Siddharth, if you remember the details, can you correct me if I'm wrong? We couldn't support them, and NetApp submitted a PR, and that got merged. Another PR that got merged was OVA testing. That was a merge. We've been waiting for content library support in GoVC, in GoVMami, and that was added thanks to Andrew, Hui, Doug, and Mark Beek. And Hui updated the PR for that. So that's really nice. Another thing that was added recently is support for, and this is mostly in the main repo, but it trickles down into vSphere, the vSphere provider. We can now support, there's been a couple of issues merged. We can now support creating clusters in multiple namespaces and in multiple cluster in a single namespace. Lastly, I want to add that this is something a little bit old, but I never brought it up in previous SIG VMware, but the cluster CTL now has support for kind. So if you don't want to use Minikube, you can use kind as, if you're using the self-service workflow where you have to create a bootstrap cluster, you can now use kind. Kind is a project inside the Kubernetes community to basically stand up a Kubernetes cluster within Docker containers. So all you need is Docker. You don't need Minikube. You don't need Docker machine drivers. You don't need, you don't need any. You don't need a hypervisor. So, and it starts up a lot faster, and it seems to be a lot more reliable than Minikube. So that's a
curious. Something else I was looking at as an idea, since it runs a whole cluster inside a Docker container, I presume.
Multiple containers, yeah.
Nested Kubernetes, where you've got actually a Kubernetes running inside a container hosted on Kubernetes.
So repeat the last part again.
I'm just wondering, I'm not that familiar with kind, but as you described it as running Kubernetes inside a Docker container.
Yeah.
Does that mean that you could run a Kubernetes inside Kubernetes? In other words, since it runs in a Docker,
oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
I throw it in a pod and have
this is Steve.
Kubernetes.
Steve, the testing for SIG testing people are already doing that because there are currently end-to-end tests that use kind as a deployer of Kubernetes, and all of that runs inside a pod that is in a Kubernetes cluster, in the Prow Kubernetes cluster. So this is already possible, and if we look at all the layers, it's basically Docker and Docker and Docker, like 10 layers of layering already. It's completely crazy what they're doing.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I'm going to have to look into that. The reason I ask is in 2 days, I'm running a workshop. I mentor kids at a high school, and we're having a hackathon there, and I'm going to be teaching them Kubernetes, and they have limited resources. And it would be a wild idea if I could run Kubernetes inside Kubernetes.
You should definitely use kind for it. It works really well. I use it with a lot of my customers just to get them up and get going. It's a fantastic project.
Okay, thanks.
Speaking of preferring kind over Minikube, I do have to mention one other thing about Minikube in case I haven't mentioned it in the past. So Fabio had a PR open on Minikube to merge in support for vSphere. It's been sitting there for months and months, and it got merged recently. So now, and we've updated the cluster API documentation so that all you have to do now is just to download a release version of Minikube. You don't have to do all that Git patching and and building your own Minikube anymore. So if you're still using Minikube, it's a lot easier now. So that's all of the support all the updates I have on Cluster API.
Thanks, Luke. Yeah, that was a very, very, very long PR. Like, I think I even deleted the original fork that I had and I had to recreate it because it was that long ago. Awesome. Lots of good progress on that, actually. I like that. I put this up for discussion, so CSI plugin for vSphere. I see that there's Travis here, or David. Do you guys want to give an update on what's going on there? Lots of activity.
I can kind of give you a short version. Yeah, I got to come in this week since SIG architecture was canceled today. David has been busy adding some new features, actually, which has been super useful, but some minor bug fixes. There's a check that happens at CSI plugin startup now to check the minimum version of vCenter, so that if we're talking to an older API, we just fail early and you don't you don't spin your wheels wondering why it doesn't work. But the upcoming focus for us over the next few weeks is really getting all of the community-based testing in place. So there's still kind of a minimal amount of unit testing, and there's no end-to-end testing still. And that's going to be the major focus right now before we continue to add new features. As you mentioned, Fabio, wanting to cut like a 0.2 or whatever you want to call it release at the end of March. By that time, the additional new features that we'd be looking at that aren't already there are this upgrade scenario where if you're moving from in tree to out of tree on the actual storage subsystem, you'll move from the existing disks to first class disks. So this would be the automatic promotion of existing PVs to be using first class disks. That's the main one. And then the other one that isn't there still is support for raw block volumes. So this is something within the CSI spec that you can attach a block device to a container or a workload within Kubernetes and ignore the file system. So you give the container raw block access to the device without mounting it as a file system, whether it's XFS or ext4 or whatever you're using. And those are kind of the main outstanding features that are left on our to-do list.
Travis, that last bit, that sounds an awful lot like RDMs. Is that kind of the idea?
I don't know RDMs. Could you tell me what it is and maybe then I can...
Oh, sorry. Yeah, in
That's
vSphere
okay.
we have a concept called raw device mappings, and it's essentially used to allow full SCSI pass-through from multiple VMs to a single block device, usually used for like Windows Server failover clusters and that kind of stuff that require a shared block volume.
Okay. Yeah, I think it would be similar, except it certainly wouldn't be for multiple VMs. So this would be a single node, has full rewrite access to it. But whatever container you're mounting it to has full control over it.
Okay. I'm just kind of wondering is there like an example use case you guys have? Because if it's, mapping through a raw block device, that container can't move around or the PV can't move around in that case. So
yeah, the use case is basically supporting the spec fully, but the use cases I've seen from like a container workload perspective is being able to say run a clustered file system in containerized workload where say you're running something in containers like GPFS or Cephs, like CephFS, and you want to run them as containerized workload, and they need full access to the disk rather than having a file system laid on it.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Yeah, the easiest one I can think of with my background would be like running Ceph in containers, which they do today, but it's kind of hacky. But yeah, if the process that's actually controlling the disk
as raw block access, you can do a lot more.
Hey, Travis. I
Mhm.
didn't catch the that last thing that you guys were talking about. Would you mind editing the document and just add in a summary for that last?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, I can do that. And then if David, if you want to add anything, I'll let you, but I probably skipped something important you've done.
No, I think you covered it all. Yeah, it was perfect.
Awesome. Good progress there as well. Excited to actually get to tag 02 or whatever we're going to call it. So I've seen good progress. Seen actually a lot of users picking up the auto tree components. Saw the interactions on Slack. Very different from in-tree. So it's interesting to see people, getting stuck on the same things we got stuck when we started looking into auto tree components. But yeah, that's part of the game, I guess. That's pretty much it for today. Just put here in the agenda open mic for discussion. So if anybody has anything they want to bring up for discussion or questions, PSAs or anything.
Miles, I wanted to shout out to you on that great blog. I see you joined late, but we were talking about the blog earlier in the meeting.
Oh yeah, thanks. It was really just for my own sanity so that I could repeatedly deploy stuff. But yeah, it's had a couple of revisions since it first went out. I think Kenny was trying to use it and he ran into a few problems that I hadn't fully covered. So it's going to be an evolving thing anyway.
Good stuff. I loved it.
Sweet.
I had another thought, Fabio, too, since earlier we were talking about possible ideas for session proposals for KubeCon China. We talked so long on in-tree versus out-of-tree, both for cloud provider and storage, that it's occurring to me that that's obviously a session candidate. I mean, that would make a great session, and we haven't had a talk on that before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point.
The timing in June should be such that the out-of-tree versions of both storage and cloud provider should have advanced quite a bit by then, to the point where they should be candidates for production deployment, or I would hope so. So maybe we do a compare of what's in those versus the old one, and even if the migration isn't fully in place, to do an automated migration, we could cover how you do the manual migration.
Yep, I like that.
Yeah, I think you guys found your session.
Yeah, and if anybody out there wants to be a co-presenter on that topic, please.
Yeah, please reach out.
Should we see if any of our people in China would be willing to co-present?
Yeah, we should. I have already reached out to Alan Ran and Stephen Ran, saying that we're interested in candidates. So it isn't just VMware in China, but any other users in China. But I think they've had the Lunar New Year, so there potentially a lot of people are still not back to work yet. But I'm expecting to hear from them.
Yeah, this is also a pretty bad time slot for China, since it's the middle of the night for them. So unfortunately, not many participate in this call. So it's maybe nice to put that out in the channel. Steve, if you want to summarize the idea and see if there's, because I believe that, judging from last year's experience at KubeCon Shanghai, it's much better if there's Chinese speaker doing the presentation, not just for ease of translation, I guess. Because I know for a fact that going to a session in Chinese and listening into the translation is not as good as when you actually hear somebody that speaks your language. It's totally different. So sometimes it's hard to understand some of the concepts. So
you have 4 months to learn Chinese, Fabio. That should be easy.
I learned to say hi, so that's a good start. All right. Anything else? Going once. And twice. 3 times. All right. I can give you guys back 15 minutes of your time. See you in 2 weeks. Bye, folks.
Bye.
See ya.